All right, buckle up because we are diving headfirst into a story today. And it's one of those that's both kind of horrifying, but also really fascinating. We're talking Ed Gein, and you've given me a ton of stuff on him, Wikipedia, true crime transcripts, even some fictional stuff. Looks like maybe a podcast or something inspired by Gein. So where do we even start? I mean, our goal here is to go beyond just how shocking this guy's story is and really try to understand what turned this seemingly, quote unquote normal dude from small town Wisconsin into, one of the most infamous killers in history.
Well, and that's what I find so intriguing about Gaines' case. It really clashes with the typical image of a horror story setting.
Right.
We think dark alleys and bustling cities, not Plainfield, Wisconsin.
It's true.
Yeah,
You think small town and what comes to mind? A tight knit community, potlucks, maybe that one neighbor with a quirky habit, but
okay.
nobody's picturing someone making furniture out of
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Ginn so unsettling. He reminds us that darkness can lurk in even the most innocent-seeming places. To really understand how this happened, though, I think we need to rewind a bit. Start with Ginn's childhood, specifically the ever-present force that was his mother, Augusta.
Yeah, and Augusta Gein was, at least from what I'm getting from these sources, she was intense,
Yeah.
deeply religious, controlling, and honestly, she had some pretty disturbing views when it came to women and sin.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. She was utterly convinced that the outside world was nothing but temptation and wickedness. I mean, she straight up forbade Ed from having friends and constantly hammered into him this fear of sin and danger of female sexuality.
It's like she built this tiny, warped little world for Ed, right? And anything outside of that was a threat. The documentary transcript mentions this incident. It really highlights this whole thing. It's the story about Augusta taking Ed and his brother Henry to see this guy Smith.
Yes. Oh, that story is so revealing. See, Augusta sees this guy Smith beating a dog. Now, obviously, that's awful on its own. But what really sets her off is the woman who tries to step in and stop him. Augusta, she calls the woman Smith's harlot, completely ignores the animal cruelty and zeroes in on this woman's supposed sin.
Talk about a skewed perspective, right? And you can really see how that kind of thinking, how that warped worldview could take root in a kid like Ed, especially with his isolated upbringing and the desperate need for his mother's approval. But something I keep coming back to is that, again, he wasn't a total recluse before all of this went down, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It's not like he was some shadowy figure lurking in the background. I mean, the guy held down jobs. People in town considered him reliable. He even went to dances. There's actually a quote from someone in the documentary who described him as someone you'd never suspect of anything other than being a decent person, which, knowing what we know now, is, well, that's chilling.
It's like those old sayings, right? The quiet ones you got to watch out for, or it's always the ones you least suspect. Because it's like the scariest monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight, the ones disguised as normal. So we've got this isolated upbringing, this controlling and arguably emotionally abusive mother who's demonizing women, but then again, still out there interacting with the community, appearing, at least on the surface, somewhat normal to those who didn't really know him.
And that right there, that's a crucial detail to remember, because it adds another layer of complexity to this already complicated story, you know?
It really does make you think, like the fact that he could seem so normal to some folks makes it all the more jarring when, well, when things took a turn. And speaking of, things really start to shift after Ginn experiences a series of losses in his life. First, his dad, George, passes away.
Right. And even though George wasn't exactly a big presence in the house, due to his drinking and all, his death in 1940, followed then by Ed's brother Henry's death in that weird fire just 4 years later, well, it leaves Ed alone with Augusta.
And the details around Henry's death, I mean, they're definitely, let's just say they raise some questions. The transcript mentions witnesses reported seeing bruises on his head, and yeah, officially it was ruled an accident, but there were whispers even back then about whether Ed, who often got criticized by Henry for being so attached to their mom, well, some folks wondered if maybe he was involved. It's like it adds this layer of unsettling foreshadowing to the whole thing, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we can't say for sure what went down there, but it definitely brings to light the unhealthy dynamics that were already at play in the Ginn household. And then, after Henry's death, Augusta has a stroke, which leaves Ed as her sole caretaker.
Yeah.
So you can imagine how that just amplified their already, intense and kind of claustrophobic bond.
Totally. Try to picture it. You're pushing 40 and you're still completely dependent on your aging mother. It speaks volumes about a stunted emotional development, right? And this warped sense of responsibility that honestly probably played a part in everything that came after.
And then the real turning point. Augustus' death in 45. For the first time in his life, Ed is truly alone.
Man, just think about that for a second. Imagine the only world you've ever known, however distorted or messed up it might have been, is just gone. It's
Yeah.
like this gaping void. And that kind of emptiness, when you combine it with years of isolation and warped morality, well, it's almost like creating the perfect breeding ground for something really sinister to take root.
And boy, did it ever. And he starts devouring these pulp magazines, true crime stories, anything about Nazi atrocities, especially anything to do with Ilse Koch, the bitch of Buchenwald,
Yep.
infamous for supposedly making lampshades out of human skin.
It's like he was searching for something, some kind of outlet, looking for a reflection of his own twisted thoughts, maybe, in these horrific stories. Did those stories, though, do you think they planted a seed? Like, offered some sort of blueprint for the darkness that was already festering inside of him?
It's a chilling thought for sure. But what's even more chilling is that Gein didn't stop at just reading about these atrocities. He starts creating his own. Just 2 years after Augusta dies, he starts robbing graves, targeting recently deceased middle-aged women in particular.
And not even robbing them in the traditional sense, right? It wasn't about valuables or anything like that. He was after the bodies themselves, especially the ones that reminded him of his mother. He even admitted later on to trying to exhume his own mother's body, said he was going to bring her back home, but the concrete vault stopped him. I mean, just let that sink in for a minute. The lengths this guy was willing to go to, all driven by this macabre need to, like, reconnect with his dead mother.
It's a clear sign of how deep his delusion ran. This desire to rebuild this world where he wasn't alone, even if it meant populating that world with the dead. And tragically, the grave robbing, that was just the beginning. His obsession with death, with possessing something that he could never truly have, well, it eventually drove him to take a life.
And that first confirmed victim was Mary Hogan. She owned a tavern and disappeared in December of 54. It's interesting, the documentary mentions how Ginn actually made jokes about Hogan being at his house after she vanished, and people, they just brushed it off as his weird sense of humor.
It's terrifying, isn't it? Just how easily a predator can blend in, especially in a place like Plainfield, where folks thought they knew their neighbors. But the truth is, behind that mask of normalcy, Ginn had done something truly horrific. He'd shot Hogan, taken her body back to his farmhouse, and, well, let's just say things get even more disturbing from there.
This is where those details from the Wikipedia article, even though they're gruesome, become really important for understanding just how deep Ginn's depravity went. He wasn't satisfied with just ending a life. He wanted to, like, possess it, reshape it in this twisted reflection of his desires. He skinned Mary Hogan, dismembered her body, and then used her remains to create, get this, furniture, masks. There's even this whole woman's suit made out of human skin that he reportedly wore around the house.
This detail, it'll send chills down your spine. Gein, he made everyday objects, clothing even, from the remains of his victims. It's believed that this whole macabre crafting thing stemmed from this desire to literally, and I mean literally, inhabit his mother's skin, which just further highlights the deeply disturbing nature of their relationship.
It's like he was trying to build this grotesque replica of his mother, like a living doll, but made from the stolen flesh of other women. And for 3 years, this horrifying secret, it remained hidden. But then, in November of 57, Ed Gein kills again. And this time, this carefully constructed world of darkness he'd built, well, it all comes crashing down. So we left off with Gein claiming the life of Bernice Worden in 57. And this is where, like we talked about before, those small-town dynamics, they really come into play. Because Bernice, she wasn't just someone living on the outskirts of town like Mary Hogan. She was a central figure in Plainfield, owned the local hardware store.
Yeah, so when she disappeared on November 16th, well, it sent shockwaves through the entire community. Imagine that, right? You go from thinking, oh, those kinds of horrible things, they only happen in big cities, not here, to bam, realizing that evil, that darkness could be lurking right next door. Maybe someone you even said hello to just yesterday.
And in this case, all the clues, they led right back to Ed Gein. It was actually Bernice's son, Frank. He was a deputy sheriff, and he found a sales slip from Ginn's purchase at the hardware store, right there, amongst all the signs of a struggle. That's when the police finally went to Ginn's farmhouse. And I'm guessing, even at that point, the worst they were expecting was to question him about Bernice's disappearance, right? But what they found when they got there was, well, to say it was like something out of their worst nightmares. That's putting it mildly.
The transcript, it doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
It paints a really vivid and honestly terrifying picture of what those officers stumbled into. It wasn't just the fact that they found Bernice Worden's body hung upside down, dressed out like a deer. It's just a sheer volume of horrors that they were met with.
It's tough to even get your head around even knowing about it secondhand. I mean, the transcript mentions human skulls on bedposts, bowls made from human skulls, masks made from the skin of women's faces. Talk about horrifying craftsmanship. It really was like stepping into some macabre museum, but instead of celebrating history, it was a shrine to death. And wow.
And if that wasn't enough, in the midst of all this, they found remains from Mary Hogan, confirming, after years of speculation, what had happened to her. The house, from what I gather, with its perfectly kept rooms dedicated to Augusta, stood in stark contrast to these workshops where Gein had been, well, indulging his darkest impulses. It's like this house wasn't just the home of a killer. It was a physical manifestation of a mind that was honestly warped beyond our comprehension.
It really makes you wonder, with everything they found, how did he manage to keep it hidden for so long? And maybe more importantly, why? We've talked about his unhealthy attachment to his mother, his totally skewed sense of what's right and wrong, but this level of depravity, the meticulous work he put into all of it, it just screams premeditation, and that's a really chilling thought.
Yeah, and that's what I find so fascinating about trying to unpack Ed Gein's psychology.
Mhm.
Because unlike a lot of serial killers who are driven by sadism or this niche for control over others,
Hmm.
Gein's motives seem to be rooted in this desperate, albeit twisted, longing for connection. It wasn't about power over his victims for him. It was about absorbing them, almost becoming them, and in a way, especially his mother. It's this really messed up kind of love fueled by years of isolation and, well, a broken moral compass.
You're right. It's like this dark reflection of something we all crave, that human connection. And that actually brings us to Dame's legacy because it reaches far beyond the borders of Plainfield, Wisconsin. I mean, in his case, horrific as it was, it's imprinted itself on our collective consciousness. It's inspired countless books, movies, even music. It's like this morbid ripple effect, and I think it speaks to our really strange simultaneous attraction to and repulsion from these dark aspects of human nature.
It's true. Think about some of the most iconic horror movies ever made, Psycho, with Norman Bates and that creepy relationship he had with his mother, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with Leatherface wearing masks made of human skin, even Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, with his morbid obsession with the human body. Each of those characters and countless others, they owe a debt to Ed Gein. It's like he didn't just inspire these stories, he gave us a whole new language for horror, one rooted in the terrifying thought that the monsters we fear, they aren't hiding in the shadows, they're living right among us, disguised as everyday people.
That's a chilling thought, and it brings us to, well, I guess our final thought for today. If Ed Gein, with his limited access to the darker sides of the world and all that information, if he could commit these acts, it really makes you think, what could someone with similar proclivities do today? With all the knowledge and, let's be honest, often disturbing stuff that's readily available at our fingertips. It's a scary thought, but an important one, because it reminds us that the real horror of Ed Gein's story isn't just in those gruesome details. It's in that uncomfortable truth that the potential for darkness, well, it exists in us all. And sometimes all it takes is the right, or I guess the wrong, set of circumstances to bring it bubbling to the surface.
Well, that's a sobering thought to end on, but I think you're spot on. Maybe that's the most important thing we can take away from a deep dive like this. One, it's not just about going down the rabbit hole of these dark and disturbing cases, but about using what we learn to try and understand ourselves, understand the world around us, and the importance of being aware of those shadows lurking inside each of us.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. The next time you find yourself in some seemingly perfect setting, a quaint little town, a friendly get together, remember Ed Gein's story. Remember that even in the brightest light, darkness can find a foothold. So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay aware.